The last words a person may say to us, the last words a person may say in a conversation, maybe the last instructions someone gives us before we go out to do something. I can think of many examples from my own life. I can remember the last words a friend said to me before he died unexpectedly. I can remember the last words that teachers have said when ending a class. I can remember last words that I said ending a conversation with someone that I'm like, that was so stupid. And you just wish you could go and recap that. I remember one of my mentors and a person who had a big impact on my ministry, Stan Buck. He had gone through this teaching session with us. He'd gone through so many classes, and in the last one, he got through the material he wanted to present, and we had a lot of fun, the class, kind of celebrating together, and he took a moment and he just said, listen, when you go into ministry, don't play around. He said, there's something so big for each one of you to do, and there are so many people out there that will kind of idle their time away. He said, what's your passion? What's your love? If it's not Jesus Christ, you need to look at yourself, because when you go into ministry, you're going out to reach people for Jesus Christ. I remember those words of his, and those were the last that he taught us. And sadly, those were the last he shared before he passed away. And I remember Camp Adventure, and at this point, there might be some of you that are tired of hearing about Camp Adventure. I'm sorry. But the camp that I take our youth to, that I've worked at as a volunteer for so many summers, at one point, I was just a counselor figuring out what camp was all about, and I worked under one director for many, many years. He had worked at Camp Adventure. He had loved Camp Adventure. He had seen students' lives change at Camp Adventure. And his last words at Camp Adventure, he decided, this is it. I'm done. I'm not going back anymore. I've put in a lot of years, and it's time for someone else to come up. And I remember him standing before a group of junior high students. Typically, I'm not trying to hurt anyone's feelings here, but typically a difficult group to work with. Typically, they're uncomfortable with themselves. You need to be comfortable with yourself. And he went to speak the final day of this, his final time being at Camp Adventure, and he was serving communion. And he lifted up the communion cup, and he was about to give the same message that he had given every time I had worked under him at Camp Adventure, and he started to tear up. And instead of going on with the usual words, he had one last chance. And he set the cup down for a minute, and he said, Camp Adventure is a place of hope. And before he went with the words of institution, before communion, he said, there is hope for each one of you here. And if you found something that touched your life this week, hold on to that. If you haven't yet, this is a place where hope is offered. And I remember those words that he gave. I remember how it choked him up. But it's like, I have one last chance. Script aside, these are the words I need to say. And I wonder if I asked if I would have any brave souls, if you can think quickly this morning, can you remember maybe some words someone imparted to you that are important, something that you can't get out of your head that you remember? Anybody want to share? Yes, Heather? Okay. We didn't dance much here, but we'll dance when we get to heaven. Yeah. And that left an impression on you, right? I mean, those words somehow, they carry a gravity. Anybody else, really quickly, want to share? I've been privileged as a pastor to be there when people are with their loved ones as they're dying. And sometimes it's just prayers. And prayers carry great power. I'm not trying to dismiss that. Sometimes the loved one has one last thing they're trying to get out. Like I said, when classes conclude, all different scenarios, there comes a point where you go, I wish I could part in this way in your head, and you try and offer words that will leave an impression. Jesus did the same thing. Jesus lived a life where he went and changed the lives of others. But when he was with his disciples and he had this last window before he would be arrested, before he would be put on trial, and before he would be crucified and ultimately killed, Jesus had last words he wanted to make sure that his disciples heard. And so in the different Gospels, they'll have their different focus. They all draw out different things and kind of want to portray a certain picture, but it's all part of one bigger picture of Jesus. But when we read John's Gospel, John has this huge section, It feels like it's 7 or 8 chapters long and you read through it, but really it takes place in what we assume was 24 hours or less. John focuses in towards the end of his gospel on the last time that Jesus had with his disciples, about the time of the Last Supper, before he's taken away. And John gives us this wonderful look into a window that we don't see in the other Gospels. John draws in on what were some of these teachings, what were some of these things that Jesus said before he was taken away from his disciples. Jesus, for 3 years or so, had these people that followed him closely. Every moment of every waking day, he was investing in their lives. He was teaching them. And so what would Jesus say if he could kind of sum it up and he's thinking, I'm about to leave this earth. I'm about to be separated from them. I love them. I want them to carry on. What would I say? And we assume that these words would be really important, right? I mean, we can assume that what Jesus said at the last was meant to leave an impression on them. In John 13, verse 34, Jesus says the following, according to John's Gospel. I give you a new commandment. Now, the disciples may not have realized this was kind of the last hour with Jesus. They didn't fully understand what was about to happen. They may have been thinking, okay, after we're done with dinner, we'll see you tomorrow, Jesus, and it didn't work that way. But here comes Jesus with just this little window left with his disciples, and he says, I give you a new commandment. Love each other. I give you a new commandment, and it's this. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, so you also must love one another. So my message this week is just a continuation of the messages I've been giving about the new year. And we had something new about the church. It's not static. It's actually something that moves. And it's not a place. It's not a building. It's you, the people. We had a new commandment that Jesus offered here. And last week I talked about the new covenant, the new relationship that we have with God. And it's because we're not bound by the Old Testament rules and regulations so much as we're under a new covenant, a new relationship with God. And that's born out of grace. And I talked about that. And I promised you this week that I would simplify it. And here it is. Jesus telling his disciples, again, in an important time, trying to sum up, like, how can I send them? How can I let them know what's one thing they could remember? And he says, I give you this new commandment. Now, they were probably thinking, great. We have enough Old Testament laws to follow that we can't even keep track of all of them. And he's giving us another. Folks, get out the scrolls. Let's write this down. Mark it in stone. Jesus says, I give you this. Love one another. And that's his new commandment. Jesus didn't say, here, I'm going to kind of summarize everything and put it in a neat little package, even though that's what he was doing. He said, this is a commandment. This is imperative. This is a must-do. If I could leave you with something, here it is. Let me make it short. Let me make it sweet. Love one another. And the disciples, I would guess. I mean, if I were standing in their spot, I would be like, okay, great, love each other. Now, what's the new commandment? But that was it. That's what Jesus intended. That's the new commandment. Love one another. John 13:34. Just as I have loved you, so you must love one another. This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples. Oh, now maybe they get it. Maybe not in full, but that adds a little weight to it, doesn't it? Okay, so if you want to show the world that you are following me, if your lives have been changed and you want to show the world how, if you want to be different than where I found you, here's the way you're going to do it. Love one another, and by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples when you love each other. Later on in that same period, as Jesus is talking with them, and it's John 15 at this point, but the same kind of teachings, the same kind of message, the same time frame Jesus is sharing with his disciples. He says, as the Father has loved me, in other words, as God has loved me, so I have loved you too. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I kept my Father's commandments and remain in His love. I've said these things to you so that my joy will be in you and your joy will be complete. But this, Jesus says it again, this is my commandment. Love one another just as I have loved you. This is a new command. This is a new directive. This is a new order not stated in that way before. And Jesus thinks that it is sufficient to summarize and to send His disciples out with from what He's been teaching. This new command, it is less complicated than the Old Testament commandments. It is less complicated because it's singular. It is less complicated because, hey, if you shouldn't eat lobster, don't eat a lobster. It's less complicated because if you need to offer a sacrifice on the fourth day and you need to bring this animal in this way for forgiveness, whatever, it's less complicated because it's love one another, but it's more demanding. Jesus' final command here is less complicated than the rules they had in Scripture at this point, but it demands more of them. Is it easier to follow a written out set of instructions or to figure out in a situation how you're going to love somebody? Is it easier to say, well, it's Tuesday of the third month of the fourth week of the blah, 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 and here's what I need to do, go do it? Or to find somebody who's acting like a jerk towards you and say, how am I going to love them? It's less complicated, but it's more demanding. One another, and I find this fascinating. One another, we have two words in English. We say each other or one another, that's how it's translated. But in the Greek, it's a Greek word called allelon. So one another that includes other people is actually allelon. That's the Greek word. I'm not making that up. It's used 100 times in 94 New Testament verses. How is that? Allelon, each other, one another, is used 100 times in 94 New Testament verses. Most of those are given as instruction to the church, and of the majority of those, 60% come as instructions from Paul. I give you that information for the following reason. When Jesus said, here's a new command, it's not the last time anyone ever heard it, and it wasn't so simple that everybody goes, okay, love each other. Got it. It took a lot of explaining, it took a lot of reminding, it took a lot of teaching, it took a lot of expanding, a lot of pushing, a lot of urging, because this one command that ends with allelon, but is all about other people, is to love one another, and it's not easy to do. And I think Jesus knew that. And I think when He said it to His disciples, He was both telling them, do this, and challenging them with that. All of those other uses, all of those 100 other times this phrase is used in the New Testament, all of the places it's recorded are an expansion. They are an elaborating on what Jesus said. And Paul gave so many instructions when he came along to help the other churches, to help the other people, to help those understand exactly what Jesus meant by love one another. He gave those in what I've heard called the one another list. I think it's funny to call it the all-alone list. But Paul gives a whole bunch of uses on how this looks. So to love one another, remember that. And people say, but how do I do that? What's that look like? How do we apply this? Where do we go with it? And Paul gives these verses that I've drawn out again to make a list of one another's. Forgive one another. You want to love one another? This is how it looks. Forgive one another. When people treat you wrongly, when people make a mistake with you, when people have done something and they realize later that it was wrong or they don't realize it was wrong, forgive them. That's how you love them. Accept one another. I don't know if I need to explain that one at all. We have a darn hard time accepting one another. Believe it or not, I've been ridiculed this morning by fans of other teams as though there were any other teams. That's funny, but it's not funny what happens in the world, what happens among the nations, what happens in our neighborhoods, our schools, our places of work. Accept one another. Not just try and ignore so that you don't fight with, but accept one another. This is how you love each other. Care for one another. Meet the needs, be supportive, show concern, care for one another. That's another scenario that Paul uses to help explain this command to love each other. Encourage one another, submit to one another, restore one another, bear with one another, carry one another's burdens. These are all different ways that Paul used that are picked out of various verses, and later in another series I might expand on those for you, but this is all stemming from, it's all drawn out of an extension of love one another. And Jesus said this, love one another, is my command. And he said it to his disciples again in a very heavy way, that if I can't get you to remember what I've taught you and what I've showed you and what you've done, remember this, love one another. And guess what? They didn't always get it right. And therefore, when the church started and churches were growing and people were saying, we got to spread this message of Christ, how's it go again? Paul gave them these explanations. And as those individuals failed to always get this right, Paul would say the command is there, love one another, and here's how you do it, and explain the list. These are all based off of the one command that's the definitive mark of how we should live. Our lives as followers of Jesus Christ can be simplified and summed up, and God's love can be made evident. God's love can be seen by how we love each other. If you take that one another list, if you take that statement, love one another, I'm really curious as to how it would look in the world, how it would change the way you live, how it would change the way others live. I'm really curious if we could follow that simple yet demanding command that Jesus gave, how our lives would be different. I think about how marriages would be changed if we lived by this list. For the people that tell me, I don't know, I'm considering divorce, Pastor Devin. For the people that say it just didn't work out. For the people that say, we weren't made for each other and the time has passed. And I wonder how marriages would look, how we'd be changed if husband and wives mutually submitted to each other, forgave each other, accepted each other, cared for and encouraged each other. How would that command, love one another, change a marriage relationship? How would families and home environments be different if we shared each other's burdens instead of created burdens for others to carry? How would families and home environments be different if we worked to lift each other up, to restore one another? How would the home in the common household, how would the family, for the average family, look different if everyone in that unit tried to love each other? How would your school, how would your office, how would your place of work where you find yourself during the day, how would that be different if we would treat each other in the ways Paul listed? If we would treat each other with the all alone list, if we would one another with each other? How would those environments look different? How would our nation be different if we chose to love one another? I'm not just talking about the government, although certainly I'm talking about the government. I'm talking about all the relations that we have with other countries, the problems within our nation, and I just wonder how many would be resolved if we accepted one another, if we were able to bear with one another, if we were able to truly dig down, have conversation, and love one another. Jesus commanded this of his followers. Love one another. How could we change all these scenarios? How would our relationships be different? How would our world look different if we could truly live this, love one another? I'll bet you can remember that the rest of today and the rest of this week and maybe the rest of this year. Jesus gave a new command. What is it? I'll give you a second shot. Jesus gave a new command. What is it? I'll bet you can remember that for a long time, because it's a lot more simple than even the 10 commandments. Let's say we get a top 10 list, and thou shalt not, okay? I'll give you one. Love one another. You can remember that. I'll bet you it's the toughest thing you'll try and do all year, to live that out. to carry that out. When you get upset with someone, to put that above your anger at them. When you feel like you've been cheated out of something, to put that before your own concern. When you're confused and you're afraid and you want to draw on yourself, to still consider someone else's needs. I'll bet you can remember love one another a long time. I'll bet it's the hardest thing you do all year. Jesus came to change the world, and I'm telling you, if we could live these words out everywhere as we went, this world would be transformed. This world would be totally different. If you could live this out perfectly, and every follower of Christ would live this, I'll bet if you could fast forward 10 years, this world would be unrecognizable. Jesus came to change the world, and that's how He intended to do it, that simple but demanding command. So sometime later, this is interesting to me, Jesus gave that command to His disciples. As I said, eventually, after He talked to them just a little more, but left them with that new command, a new command I give you, this you must do, love one another as I have loved you. Jesus gave them that command. And let's say, I don't know, it depends on who you follow as a scholar and how you read it, but let's say 30, maybe 50 years later, there's a group of people, and they're either being taught by John, who recorded those words, or they're reading John's writings, and it doesn't really matter which way it is, but that gospel, that scenario we just looked at in John, including the words, the new command from Christ, love one another, there's a group 30 to 50 years later, and they're studying this. They're a church now. They're gathered together in one area. And they're saying, how is it that we can look like Jesus to the world? How is it that we can carry this message on? We have John's writing, or maybe they said, John, you're teaching us, but how do we live that out? And in 1 John, so you have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John at the end of your Bible. Fancy word for them is epistles. You don't need to know that. But there's 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John that are separate from the Gospel of John. That's this community studying in some form this teaching. And they're trying to live this out. They're trying to show themselves as followers of Jesus. They're trying to make sense of, in the world that we live in, how do we live this out? What's important to know about Jesus? What's important to remember? And in 1 John 3:11, they find this verse. This is the message you've heard from the beginning. We should love one another. That's the conclusion they come to. It's not a new command at this point. It's not new anymore in the way it's recorded. That was actually something they saw evidence of all the way back to the beginning of humanity. So they say this is the message that you've heard from the beginning, and this is what they arrive at as how we're going to represent Jesus in the world. We should love one another. That's it. Again, whether they were hearing this from John or reading his writings and studying it, this group that was intended as recipients of John's writings, they said, we will love one another. And that has always been what it's about. And that's a pretty good summary of Jesus' teachings. It's nothing new. We should love one another. And so let me go back when I think about last words, and I say how important those must have been that Jesus taught those. And I say I can remember last words that somebody left for me in different scenarios, but let me go back to that and ask you, what will your final testimony be? When people look at you someday, when you move on maybe to a new area because you relocate, when you find that you're at the end of a relationship with someone because they're moving or you just don't have contact anymore, maybe when your time comes, what is going to be the word that you pass on? How are people going to evaluate you? When they say, if they say, they were one of those Christ followers, they were one of those church people, they were one of those Christians, what will they remember about you? What will be the last impression or the last words that you left? Are they going to wonder, I wonder where they settled on once saved, always saved? Because that's important. Is that going to be what they ask about you? Are they going to wonder how often they attended worship services and did they ever do prayer services in between? Are they going to care about that? Are they going to wonder how did you handle any one scenario? Or are they going to wonder how did they live? And will your testimony be oh yeah, they lived a life of love. Maybe I didn't understand them. Maybe you never had the chance to tell them. But they could look at you and say, your final witness, your final testimony, the final thing that they would remember about you is that you loved them. That will speak Jesus to them. Jesus said, this is how you will show yourself as my disciples, when you love one another. And as simple as it sounds, it's not that easy, but you do it. And you love one another, and in this way, the world will know you are my followers. So we have this opportunity. We have the ability to show love where other people aren't giving room for grace at all. We have the ability to forgive. We have the ability to submit. We have the ability to encourage, to restore, to accept, to bear with, and to carry burdens alongside. We have the one another list. We have the command, love each other. May we find ourselves blessed as we live that out in our lives. This is my new command for you, that you love each other as I have loved you.